It began as a cruel joke, the kind only the wealthy and arrogant find amusing. Darren wasn't just rich, he was famous for it. A billionaire before 30, thanks to inheritance, viral businesses, and a ruthless streak that made headlines, Darren didn't just crave money, he craved attention. And now, bored of yachts and mansions, bored of breaking companies and people, he sought a new form of entertainment, a public spectacle dressed as a wedding. The bet was simple and disgusting. His group of equally narcissistic friends challenged him to marry someone they deemed beneath him, a woman mocked not for her mind or actions, but solely for her weight. Do it, one of them sneered, swirling a glass of aged whiskey. Marry her, film it, turn it into a reality show. Instant cash. Ratings will explode. And when you dump her later, you'll be untouchable. Again. Darren smirked. It wasn't about the money. It was about proving that he could play God in other people's lives and laugh about it later. They picked Clara. Clara didn't come from money. She didn't come from fame. What she had was far more dangerous to men like Darren, intelligence. But Darren wasn't interested in her mind, only the narrative her image would create. Clara was heavy-set, visibly overweight, but with striking eyes that didn't match the frame the world saw. And Darren, seeing only an object for his joke, never stopped to ask why she smiled the way she did. The engagement was announced within days, plastered across tabloids, morning talk shows, and YouTube commentary channels. "Billionaire marries plus-size nobody," screamed headlines. The cruelty of the coverage was staggering. News anchors laughed openly about it on air. Late-night hosts cracked jokes about the logistics of the honeymoon. Clara didn't flinch. In fact, her calm unnerved even Darren. The world was on his side, yet she stood at his side, unbothered by the venom being thrown at her daily. The wedding wasn't a private affair, naturally. It was broadcasted live as a pay-per-view event, advertised shamelessly. The most shocking wedding of the year, watch it unfold live. Tickets sold. Sponsors lined up. Darren smiled for the cameras like a game show host on steroids. He wore an expensive, tailored suit, flashing his perfect teeth. Clara wore a simple gown. Nothing designer, nothing glamorous. Just white, clean, and understated, like she knew exactly what she was doing. Which she did. During the vows, the audience online, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, flooded the chat with cruelty. Fat jokes, GIF, memes. Reaction videos began even before the ceremony ended. Influencers went live giving instant reviews, dissecting every facial expression Clara made. They laughed when she spoke. They jeered when she walked. And yet, Clara kept smiling. Darren played his part well. His arm around her shoulder, a performative kiss for the cameras, waving to the drones above capturing cinematic slow-motion shot. It was a circus dressed as matrimony, and Darren relished in it. He didn't see Clara's steady breath. He didn't notice the deliberate pauses in her speech. What Darren missed, in his obsession with himself, was the way Clara kept glancing not at him, but at the cameras, not with embarrassment but calculation. The cruelty didn't stay confined to internet comment. Paparazzi screamed horrific questions at her as they left the venue. One shouted, "How much is he paying you to stand next to him without vomiting?" The laughter from his friends at the reception was louder than the music. But something strange began to happen that very night. Clara didn't vanish into a hotel room in shame. No. She posted her first video that same evening. No tears. No emotional breakdowns. Just a calm, poised message simply titled, "The joke's on them." In the video, she didn't defend herself. She didn't mention Darren. She didn't beg for sympathy or tell tragic stories about high school bullies. Instead, she calmly dissected the media circus itself. She spoke about how society trained people to believe that someone's worth was based on how much they weighed, how media narratives crafted cruelty into entertainment, and how humiliation of women's bodies had been sold as comedy for decades. Her tone wasn't sad, it was surgical, controlled, powerful. Darren didn't even notice at first. He was too busy celebrating with his so-called friends, scrolling through hateful memes of Clara and laughing at the creativity of anonymous internet trolls. He didn't care what she was posting. Why would anyone listen to her? To him, she was a prop, a storyline with a shelf life of maybe a month before the divorce scandal would be orchestrated. But Clara's video started gaining views. Not because she was crying, not because she was begging, but because she was right. People didn't expect it. The clip got shared first by a few quiet body positivity influencers, then by mental health advocates, then by teachers and parents. Within 12 hours, it hit 1 million views. By the next morning, talk shows were debating it. Was it a real marriage? Was she in on the joke? Darren's agent started getting calls, not from sponsors excited to push the wedding event, but from brands wanting to distance themselves from him. Clothing brands, makeup companies, platforms that had signed on to feature exclusive clips of the honeymoon footage were pulling out. Clara's poised analysis of toxic media didn't just go viral, it exposed the machinery that had propped Darren up for years. And through it all, she smiled. Darren's friends started noticing too. "Bro, you better control this," one of them warned. "You're looking like the villain in this." Control what? Darren still didn't get it. In his mind, Clara was still the punchline, still the object of ridicule, still the overweight woman he married as a prank for views. The idea that she could outthink him wasn't even on his radar. Why would it be? His whole life had taught him that the rich and beautiful dictated the stories, and everyone else just played supporting roles. But Darren forgot one thing. The internet loved a takedown, especially of arrogant, wealthy men. Clara hadn't asked for a fight. She simply told the truth with grace. And sometimes, grace is the most powerful rebellion. In the weeks to come, that single video would ripple outward, creating waves Darren never saw coming. But on that first night, as he laughed with friends and counted imaginary profits, Clara sat in front of a small, soft light, calmly dismantling the empire of cruelty he had spent years building. And she hadn't even started yet. The morning after the wedding, the headlines were merciless. Every social media feed was flooded with screenshots, slowed-down clips of Clara walking down the aisle, close-ups of her face twisted into grotesque memes, and stitched videos by influencers mocking everything from her dress to the shape of her arms. For most people, that would have been enough to break them. Darren was counting on it. Public shame had become a currency for him. He knew how it worked. Humiliate someone publicly, let the internet devour them, and ride the shockwave of attention all the way to the bank. And for a brief moment it seemed like it would work. Reaction videos multiplied. TikToks dissected her posture, her makeup, the curve of her shoulders. Some influencers even pretended to cry in mock sympathy, building their own view counts off her humiliation. Clara didn't respond to any of it. Not directly. Instead, she uploaded another video. No theatrics, no fancy production, just a direct-to-camera message with the same calm, deliberate energy. "Good morning," she began. "I noticed a lot of people have strong opinions about bodies they don't live in." And then she did something that caught everyone off guard. She thanked them. Thanked them for the attention. Thanked them for revealing just how broken their views of worth had become. She wasn't bitter, and she wasn't broken. She was clear. Darren, meanwhile, was fielding calls. His agent was nervous. "It's not playing right," he kept saying. "It's not trending funny, it's trending angry." Darren didn't care yet. He was already working with his team on the next angle. The inevitable breakup arc, milk the outrage, spin a story about incompatibility, maybe frame her as manipulative or even unstable. Nothing personal, just business. The formula worked before, it would work again. Or so he thought. What Darren didn't see was how Clara's video wasn't about her. It was about them. The people watching. She talked about the years she spent trying to conform, trying to shrink herself, not for health, but to fit someone else's idea of what was allowed. She talked about how media had sold cruelty as entertainment, how profit was made off making women feel ashamed of existing in the bodies they were born with. And she did it with warmth, not rage. That was the threat Darren hadn't calculated. People were used to outrage. They didn't know what to do with dignity. By the third day, Clara's channel had tripled in subscribers. But more importantly, she started receiving messages. Not from celebrities or influencers, but from ordinary people. Single mothers who'd been mocked for their weight during pregnancy. Teenage girls struggling with eating disorders who said they'd never seen someone speak with that much calm strength before. Former athletes who'd gained weight after injuries, treated like they were failures by their own communities. She became a mirror, and people saw themselves inside it. Meanwhile, the sponsors Darren thought would make him richer started backing out. Quietly at first. Subtle emails about reconsidering partnership. Then full statements released on social media feeds. We stand with dignity and inclusivity. After reviewing recent content related to Mr. Kane, we will be ending all future collaborations effective immediately. Hashtag after hashtag. Hashtag dignity over drama. Hashtag bodies are not punchlines. And the brutal one that stuck. Hashtag not your joke. What started as Clara simply defending herself became something else entirely. People were not just defending her, they were defending themselves through her. And Darren, blinded by his own arrogance, still thought he could control the narrative. He posted a video, pretending to be thoughtful, trying to reframe the wedding as a social experiment about perception and beauty standards. It flopped. Comment sections filled with one sentence over and over again. She didn't need you to prove her worth. Even more humiliating, influencers who had previously mocked Clara flipped, realizing that siding with her got them more likes, more support, more reach. Entire reaction channels deleted their original roast videos and posted apologies, some sincere, most opportunistic. But it didn't matter. The momentum had shifted. And all Clara did was speak plainly, with truth. One interview changed everything. A rising journalist asked her on a podcast why she hadn't clapped back in anger, why she wasn't fighting with the same venom thrown at her. Clara's answer was simple: anger burns fast. I'm not here to burn, I'm here to build. That clip alone racked up millions of views in hours. Schools started sharing it with students. Community groups invited her to speak. Fitness companies, not weight loss brands but companies advocating healthy movement regardless of size, reached out to sponsor her. Not because she was a victim, but because she stood for something. The more Clara rose, the smaller Darren looked. His friends stopped answering his calls. Brands deleted photos with him. His online engagement dropped. Algorithms pushed his posts further down. People began revisiting his older content, dissecting the history of his humiliations, his cruel pranks, the subtle misogyny of his so-called joke. It all unraveled fast. What Darren saw as entertainment, the world began labeling for what it truly was: systemic bullying dressed up with a luxury filter. But Darren still had one play left, or so he thought. He tried reaching out to Clara directly, suggesting a joint interview, spinning it as reconciliation, hoping to siphon some of her growing popularity for himself. She declined, privately. No theatrics. No public rejection speech. Just silence, which humiliated him more than a takedown ever could. It sent a clearer message than words ever could: I'm not your storyline anymore. While Darren scrambled for relevance, Clara started something new. Quietly, with no dramatic announcement, she started a second channel, not about her weight, not about the wedding, but focused entirely on other women's stories. Survivors of bullying, women starting businesses from nothing, individuals living with chronic illness, professionals in STEM fields who'd been overlooked because of how they looked or dressed. Clara had no interest in turning her sudden fame into ego. She was building something wider, something with weight that wasn't tied to her personal tragedy but to a larger, unstoppable movement. And the media caught on. Outlets that had mocked her the week before now scrambled to book her for interviews, this time scrambling to look progressive, supportive, enlightened. Clara's responses remained the same. Sharp, kind, deliberate, focused entirely on shifting the spotlight to people who'd been denied it before. She wasn't a reality star anymore. She was a platform. Darren watched helplessly as her world expanded, while his shrank. His brand, once synonymous with viral entertainment, became shorthand for exploitation. Influencers coined a new phrase, "Don't Darren yourself," meaning don't destroy your reputation by using cruelty for clout. It was poetic justice, but Clara wasn't interested in revenge. She had already moved beyond that. The story was no longer about proving anything to Darren. It was about building a world where women didn't have to endure being reduced to a punchline just to be heard. And she was just getting started. By the fourth week, something remarkable began unfolding, something no one on Darren's side could have predicted. What had started as a single video of a woman calmly standing against ridicule had become a shift in public awareness. No orchestrated PR stunt could replicate what Clara had ignited. This wasn't sympathy anymore, this was identification. Ordinary people, influencers with genuine platforms, and even celebrities who had once played along with toxic beauty standards began speaking up. Not because they wanted views, but because they were tired. Tired of pretending that the old games of humiliation were still entertaining. And Clara had given them the vocabulary to articulate that exhaustion. Meanwhile, Darren's empire kept slipping. The endorsement deals he'd boasted about in interviews quietly evaporated. He tried pivoting, suggesting a new brand focused on embracing flaws, a desperate attempt to hijack the very movement Clara was building. But the public wasn't fooled. Even casual followers could smell insincerity from miles away. Every move Darren made reeked of self-preservation, not growth, and it only isolated him further. Podcasts that once begged him for appearances now dissected his downfall with brutal precision, using him as a case study in the inevitable collapse of ego-driven influence. Darren had spent years monetizing embarrassment, but now he was the one exposed, and the market had no interest in buying his excuses. While he spiraled, Clara's influence deepened, not because she sought to dominate headlines, but because she kept choosing substance over spectacle. Instead of chasing media drama, she focused on amplifying other voices. Small business owners who had been mocked for their appearance found their products suddenly going viral after Clara highlighted them. Single mothers who had been shamed for their bodies were now being invited to share their experiences on national platforms. And when interviewers tried steering the narrative back to the scandal of her wedding, Clara gently redirected every time. It's not about the wedding. It's about how we decide who deserves to be seen and heard. People responded to that integrity like oxygen after being underwater too long. Clara wasn't feeding outrage, she was feeding hope. And hope, when done right, becomes addictive. Darren couldn't match it because he didn't understand it. He only knew how to sell drama. He didn't know how to nurture dignity. And more than that, he didn't understand why it mattered. As the weeks turned to months, Clara began collaborating with organizations far beyond the influencer world. Nonprofits working in eating disorder recovery programs reached out. Mental health advocacy groups started using clips of her early videos in educational programs. Major conferences requested her as a keynote speaker, not for pity points, but because she spoke with clarity and care, never allowing her personal experience to be sensationalized, always folding it back into a larger cause. And here was the true brilliance of it. Clara never once positioned herself as a victim. The press tried repeatedly to frame her that way, but she didn't allow it. Victimhood wasn't the point. Agency was. Her message wasn't "look what happened to me," but "look what they tried, and look what we can build anyway." In a digital world addicted to outrage, Clara offered something profoundly different: resilience without bitterness, confidence without cruelty, power without theatrics. The economic impact surprised even industry analysts. Companies began restructuring their advertising strategies, pulling away from influencer marketing driven by cruelty-based humor. Marketing reports started noting a measurable decline in engagement for creators who relied on body shaming or humiliation to gain traction. Meanwhile, sales for the businesses Clara endorsed skyrocketed, not because she begged people to buy, but because she reminded people they deserved better than ridicule disguised as entertainment. Darren, once celebrated as the king of viral culture, became the subject of think pieces with brutal titles like The Death of the Shock Economy and When Humiliation Stops Selling. His attempts to pivot into charity work were met with skepticism so thick it could be cut with a knife. Even charities didn't want association with him, not because of Clara's campaign, but because of the public's fatigue with performative apologies from people who clearly hadn't changed. One particular interview sealed Darren's fate, though he didn't realize it at the time. He agreed to speak with a major podcast host known for hard-hitting interviews, thinking he could control the narrative. The host didn't attack him, didn't shout, didn't insult. Instead, they asked one devastatingly simple question: "Do you even know why people are angry?" Darren fumbled, tried to twist it into a conversation about internet mob mentality, about cancel culture, about personal redemption, but he never answered the question. That 2-minute clip went viral not because of scandal, but because of emptiness. Viewers saw it in his eyes. He didn't get it. He didn't understand what had shifted. And by the time he realized he wasn't controlling the narrative anymore, he was already irrelevant. Clara, on the other hand, continued her work methodically, avoiding drama traps, declining offers to appear on trashy reality shows designed to milk her story for cheap ratings. Instead, she co-founded a foundation aimed at supporting young creators who wanted to build platforms based on advocacy rather than exploitation. The foundation offered mentorship, technical support, and funding for small creative projects by people who'd been overlooked by traditional media. The irony was sharp. Darren had tried to use Clara for clout, but she had used the experience to build something enduring. What he saw as disposable content, she had transformed into a launchpad for systemic change. And in the deepest twist of poetic justice, Clara never once attacked him by name. No direct callouts, no exposés, no revenge threads, just absence. The absence of needing him, the absence of even acknowledging his relevance anymore, spoke louder than any confrontation could. Darren had wanted to be the puppet master, pulling strings for attention. But in the end, he wasn't even part of the script. Clara didn't just win the public's respect, she rewrote the rules of the game entirely. The industry noticed. Marketing agencies updated their guidelines on influencer partnerships, urging brands to prioritize creators with positive engagement histories, not just view count. Schools incorporated Clara's early videos into digital literacy programs, teaching young students how to recognize toxic media cycles before they consume them. Clara didn't chase fame. It found her, precisely because she wasn't chasing it. And Darren, still obsessing over algorithms and optics, was left behind, a relic of a dying era of entertainment. The narrative that Darren had tried to script had collapsed into nothingness, while Clara built something real, something that didn't end when the news cycle moved on. It wasn't just a moment anymore. It was a movement, and the more Darren tried to claw his way back into relevance, the more the world moved on, uninterested in another tired redemption arc from a man who never learned why he fell in the first place. Months later, while Darren faded into obscurity, Clara's influence kept growing, not because she was chasing it, but because it was inevitable. Her work wasn't about flash or spectacle. It was steady, real, human. People recognized that she wasn't trying to sell them perfection or manipulate their emotions. She was simply offering something almost forgotten in modern media: truth without conditions. And truth, no matter how quietly delivered, has a way of spreading wider than any manufactured scandal. Darren's failure wasn't just about his cruelty. It was about his complete inability to understand that people were tired. Tired of pretending cruelty was clever, tired of acting like mockery was sophisticated, tired of the same influencers weaponizing shame like it was content. What Clara taught, almost by accident, was that people were ready to move on. And they didn't need permission from algorithms to do it. By the time corporate brands started clamoring to work with her, Clara was already one step ahead. She didn't just take every offer thrown at her. She vetted partnerships, rejecting those that only wanted to clean their image. She worked with smaller companies, ethical businesses, and independent creators who'd spent years overlooked by an industry obsessed with image over substance. What shocked marketing executives was how much loyalty Clara's following showed. Unlike Darren's audience, who followed for scandal and bailed when the novelty wore off, Clara's supporters stayed. They weren't there for gossip. They were there because they recognized themselves in her voice. It wasn't just online anymore. Physical spaces started carrying her message. Bookstores hosted readings of essays inspired by her story. Gyms held workshops focused on movement for joy, not punishment. Doctors invited her to speak about patient care and how medical professionals often failed to see the full humanity of people who didn't fit into narrow aesthetic boxes. Her story didn't stay contained to influencer drama. It pushed into every area of culture where shame had been disguised as self-improvement. Clara's refusal to turn her experience into just another media circus made her dangerous to the people who thrived on exploiting insecurity for profit. She wasn't offering an escape, she was offering a return to dignity. Meanwhile, Darren's reputation became a symbol of decay. His old collaborators jumped ship. Podcast episodes featuring him quietly disappeared from archive. Even former friends began crafting "I've grown since then" posts, carefully distancing themselves from him to salvage their own brands. No one wanted to be associated with a man who had bet on another person's humiliation as his next viral hit. His apartment, once the setting for elaborate influencer parties, now echoed with silence. His DMs filled with opportunists offering schemes to rebuild the brand, but all their ideas were rooted in the same toxic patterns that had already failed him. Darren didn't understand that the game had changed. No one was interested in his redemption story, not because people were unforgiving, but because he hadn't changed. He wanted the perks of growth without the discomfort of accountability. While Darren scrambled, Clara kept building. She started using her platform to elevate others. Not just creators but everyday people. Teachers, nurses, artists, small-town entrepreneurs. And the way she did it was deceptively simple. She let them tell their own stories. Clara didn't position herself as a savior, didn't try to reframe their experiences into polished soundbite. She asked questions then listened. That humility made her magnetic. It also made her unstoppable. People followed her not because she was entertaining, but because she gave them permission to believe that their stories mattered, even if they didn't come with influencer filters or viral dances attached. And while Clara didn't dwell on revenge, others in the industry started treating Darren as a cautionary tale. Behind closed doors, influencer agencies began whispering to clients, "Don't pull a Darren. Don't be the person who bets on cruelty." It wasn't a hashtag or a trending video, it was a quiet industry shift, one of those cultural undercurrents that reshapes everything before the surface even notices. Darren was now market poison. The brands that had once flown him to luxury resorts now partnered with creators who told stories about family, community, rebuilding confidence, and showing up fully human. And then came the documentary. Independent filmmakers who'd been watching the whole saga approached Clara, not to make a tabloid hit, but to build a real narrative about cultural change. The project wasn't centered on her humiliation or the scandal. It focused on how media had normalized cruelty for decades and how Clara's moment had cracked the surface of that illusion. Clara agreed, under one condition: it wasn't going to be about her alone. It was going to feature multiple voices. Survivors of bullying, people who'd been fired because of appearance-based discrimination, former models who'd escaped toxic industry standards, even healthcare workers who'd witnessed firsthand how body shame affected patient care. The documentary wasn't going to be content. It was going to be education. And when it premiered, something rare happened. Instead of sparking another round of shallow social media debates, it ignited conversations in classrooms, workplaces, churches, and dinner tables. Parents talked to their children differently. Managers reconsidered hiring policies. Schools rewrote parts of their media literacy programs. It didn't feel like just another scandal dissected for clicks. It felt like something that was going to last. Even major universities started inviting Clara to speak. Not about weight, but about leadership, media literacy, and ethical storytelling. And the funniest part of all of it? Clara never once framed herself as a leader. She never tried to brand herself as an activist or expert. She simply moved with integrity, and people followed that integrity like a beacon in a media landscape polluted with manipulation. Darren, still lurking in the corners of social media, watched from the sidelines. Every desperate attempt to claw back relevance fell flat. Where once he'd racked up millions of views on a poorly staged prank or a mean-spirited roast, now he couldn't even break 1,000 likes. Algorithms didn't care about him anymore because the audience didn't care. And the audience didn't care because they'd seen what authenticity looked like. And once you've tasted that, the old poison doesn't satisfy anymore. The true humiliation for Darren wasn't just that he lost his platform, it was that he lost control of the story. He wanted to be the writer, the director, the main character. Instead, he became a forgotten footnote in a movement that didn't even need to mention his name to erase his influence. Clara's rise wasn't personal revenge, it was collective healing. And healing doesn't leave room for parasites like Darren who mistake destruction for creativity. What Darren never understood, and still didn't, was that you can't humiliate someone into irrelevance if they know their worth. Clara knew hers, and now, so did thousands of others who had quietly been shrinking themselves in the corners of society, waiting for someone to say, "You don't need to disappear to deserve respect." That was Clara's real victory, not the headlines, not the sponsorships, not the fame. It was that she gave people their own reflections back, unbroken. And Darren? He was just noise the world stopped listening to. A year after the entire ordeal began, it became clear that Clara's journey was no longer about one betrayal, one viral moment, or one man's selfish choices. It had evolved into something else entirely, a shift not just in conversation but in culture. People weren't merely reacting anymore, they were actively creating new standards for themselves, for the influencers they followed, for the businesses they supported, for the media they consumed. Clara hadn't positioned herself as the face of this movement, yet somehow her face appeared in murals, in community center posters, in classrooms. Not because of vanity, but because those images carried meaning now. She wasn't just a person who stood against mockery. She had become a symbol for everyone who'd ever been told they weren't good enough and dared to say, "So what?" What made the change powerful was how decentralized it was. No one had to ask for permission anymore to stand up against cruelty disguised as humor. They simply did it, and those who tried reviving the old formulas, using shame as a shortcut to fame, found themselves increasingly isolated. People had tasted something better. They didn't want empty apologies or redemption tours anymore. They wanted substance. They wanted sincerity. And Clara represented that, not because she orchestrated it, but because she embodied it without pretense. She wasn't flawless. She wasn't performing perfection. She was simply showing up, over and over, even when she didn't have the energy or the polished soundbites influencers were expected to deliver. Meanwhile, Darren's story had mutated into an urban legend among content creators. New influencers coming up were warned about him, not because they feared his influence, but because they didn't want to make the same mistake. Workshops taught emerging creators how to avoid pulling a Darren, meaning, don't build success on someone else's degradation. Marketing seminars dissected his downfall with cold precision, outlining exactly where his instincts had betrayed him and how a single thoughtless gamble had dismantled years of calculated branding. And perhaps most telling, former collaborators, now desperate to clean their own images, began openly admitting in interviews that they'd always felt uncomfortable with Darren's tactics but didn't speak up because the system rewarded silence. That system didn't exist anymore. People had seen through it and they weren't going back. Schools began developing programs based not just on media literacy, but on emotional literacy, teaching students to recognize not only misinformation but manipulation, cruelty, and performative kindness. Clara, true to form, didn't take credit for these shifts, though it was clear that her choices had sparked them. Instead, she redirected attention to others doing the work alongside her: therapists, teachers, grassroots organizers. She didn't hoard the spotlight. She used it like a lighthouse, constantly sweeping outward, illuminating other voices who might have otherwise remained in the dark. The most ironic part wasn't just that Darren had failed, it was that he still didn't understand why. Even in his rare, increasingly desperate live streams, he clung to the narrative that people just didn't get his sense of humor. He played the victim of cancel culture, completely blind to the fact that this wasn't about cancellation, it was about replacement. He hadn't been chased out. He'd been left behind. He mistook the silence of irrelevance for persecution, never realizing that people weren't angry at him anymore, they were indifferent. And in the hierarchy of digital disgrace, indifference is the sharpest blade. Clara's influence started turning into generational change. Parents who once might have accidentally passed on their own body shame now found themselves rethinking the words they used around their children. Instead of teaching kids to hide or apologize for their appearance, they taught them to ask better questions. Who profits from my insecurity? Who gets rich off my discomfort? These were the questions Darren never wanted anyone to ask, because he knew the answer was always the same: people like him. And now that the questions were being asked everywhere, in schools, online forums, book clubs, fitness spaces, that business model was collapsing under its own weight. And yet, through it all, Clara remained grounded. When publishers offered her 7-figure book deals for a sensational memoir, she refused unless the deal guaranteed full creative control and significant donations to organizations helping marginalized creators. She didn't want a ghost-written fluff piece. If she was going to tell her story, it was going to be on her terms, or not at all. Even with fame at her fingertips, Clara chose principle over popularity every time. And that's what made her untouchable. No scandal could be manufactured against her because she wasn't playing the same game. The old tricks didn't work anymore because she'd exposed the entire playbook. As for Darren, his final grasp at relevance came in the form of an apology video, heavily scripted, poorly lit, filled with vague promises to do better. The comments were a wasteland of disinterest, mixed with a few sharp reminders that Darren still didn't understand what he was apologizing for. And while he talked to a shrinking audience of people clinging to outdated internet fame strategies, Clara was in community centers, standing next to teenagers who finally believed their worth wasn't tied to their waistlines, or their skin, or their ability to fit into someone else's cruel punchline. Darren's influence died with a whimper. Clara's kept growing because it wasn't dependent on attention, it was dependent on action. Even corporations shifted strategies. They stopped using words like aspirational to describe body types and started using words like authentic, not because of focus groups, but because the market itself demanded it. You could trace that shift directly back to the ripples of Clara's early refusal to stay small. The ripple became a wave, and the wave became the new tide. Darren wanted a viral video. Clara built a cultural correction. By the end of that year, when reporters occasionally asked Clara if she felt vindicated, she always gave the same answer. This was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving people right, proving that they deserved better than what they'd been given. It wasn't vengeance. It was justice. It wasn't just exposure. It was evolution. And as Darren disappeared into the static of forgotten influencers, Clara remained steady, not at the center of a storm of scandal, but at the heart of a steadily beating change, one that no algorithm could throttle and no scandal could outshine. That was her victory, not dominance but direction, not revenge but restoration. And in the space she helped create, countless others now stood, not afraid of their own reflections anymore, but proud, visible, undeniable. Clara's story wasn't a moment, it was a movement, but more than that, it was proof that narratives don't belong to the powerful anymore. The era when influencers shaped reality through filters, edits, and cruelty disguised as confidence was over. Not because Clara single-handedly ended it, but because millions of people had been waiting for someone, anyone, to step out of that cycle and show that another way was possible. The thing that kept surprising people was how quietly it all happened. No screaming match, no scandal fueled by tabloids, no performative meltdowns broadcasted for views. Just steady, deliberate choices that exposed the entire rotten structure underneath the influencer economy. Darren represented everything that was hollow. Clara represented everything that could grow. What Darren never anticipated was that the very audience he thought he controlled was smarter than he gave them credit for. They were tired of being manipulated by fake vulnerability, tired of creators crying on cue for engagement, tired of curated tragedy turned into clickbait. They weren't bitter or cruel, they were exhausted. Clara's calm dismantling of that old playbook wasn't loud, but it was effective, and nothing scares those who profit from chaos more than calm, sustained clarity. The machine Darren thrived in needed constant outrage to survive, and without that fuel, it choked. No new scandal could reignite it because people had started choosing peace over participation. They didn't need to argue with Darren's defenders, they just left. Quietly, firmly, and permanently. What no one predicted was how the ripples of Clara's choices began influencing industries far beyond social media. Healthcare spaces began reviewing how weight stigma shaped patient treatment. Advertising agencies rewrote their entire copy strategies, abandoning before and after marketing in favor of holistic health narrative. Schools adopted new programs teaching children about the history of body politics, about the toxic beauty standards that weren't natural, but manufactured by people who profited from insecurity. Even hiring practices in major corporations began shifting, as HR departments were forced to confront the silent bias they'd been perpetuating for decades under the guise of professional appearance. None of this came from hashtags alone. It came from action, consistency, and the relentless refusal to be turned into a caricature. Clara didn't have a PR team spinning narratives. She didn't have a management firm plotting out strategic partnerships for maximum exposure. She had boundaries, clear values, and an unwavering commitment to not becoming the thing she had once been a victim of. Even when people tried baiting her into feuds with other influencers, she declined. It wasn't about avoiding conflict, it was about not allowing herself to be reduced to internet theater. And that refusal to turn her life into content gave her something far more powerful than trending metrics. It gave her credibility. Darren had never possessed credibility. He mistook visibility for influence, attention for respect, virality for leadership. And by the time he realized the difference, the doors to relevance were already closed. Meanwhile, Clara's inbox filled not with brand deals, but with letters, handwritten ones, emails from young girls who finally told their parents about the bullying they'd endured. Messages from former models who confessed that, for the first time in years, they'd looked in the mirror and felt something other than shame. Stories from older women who'd spent decades believing they didn't deserve to be seen, suddenly finding themselves volunteering at community centers, leading discussions, starting their own podcasts, not about beauty, but about belonging. These weren't followers, they were participants. They didn't want Clara to save them. They wanted her to stand beside them, to witness their emergence. And she did. The power of Clara's story wasn't that it made her exceptional, It was that it revealed how common her story was, and how many people had been told to stay small, quiet, and invisible for the comfort of others. Darren's brand was built on making people feel isolated. Clara's legacy was built on connection. And as that connection deepened, Darren's presence began to feel not just irrelevant, but embarrassing. Even his former fans avoided bringing him up, knowing full well that associating with his name now marked someone as part of an outdated, toxic mindset. Darren's name wasn't infamous, it was inconvenient. It was a reminder of bad judgment, not rebellion. And influencers, desperate to stay ahead of cultural shifts, avoided inconvenient reminders at all costs. Clara's growth wasn't linear. She didn't go from victim to hero in some neat Hollywood arc. There were setbacks, misstep, exhaustion, days she didn't post, weeks where the algorithms punished her for not being engaged enough. But unlike those who lived for numbers, Clara wasn't addicted to the feedback loop. She didn't crave applause. She didn't build her life around audience approval. That's what made her sustainable. Where others burned out, she rested. Where others clawed for visibility, she stepped back, trusting that meaningful work doesn't need constant validation to matter. It wasn't long before universities began citing Clara's story in coursework about digital ethics. Sociology departments dissected the influence of shame-based media, using Darren's collapse as a case study in hubris, unchecked privilege, and the inevitable collapse of exploitation-based platforms. Psychology conferences invited Clara to speak not as a patient, but as an expert witness to the cultural shifts happening in real time. And still, Clara deflected the idea that she was a hero. She called herself something simpler, responsible. She didn't believe in savior complexes. She believed in accountability. And that quiet insistence on responsibility turned her from an influencer into an architect of change. One particularly powerful shift came when public schools started inviting survivors of bullying, not influencers, not celebrities, just regular people, to speak directly to students. The schools didn't frame these talks around trauma, but around resilience, agency, and what it means to take up space unapologetically. Clara attended several of these assemblies, not as a headline speaker, but as a supporter in the crowd, sitting among parents, teachers, and kids. That's what separated her from the influencers who demanded front-row treatment. Clara didn't want to be above the crowd. She wanted to be part of it. Meanwhile, Darren's final descent into obscurity wasn't marked by scandal, but by silence. His uploads slowed, then stopped. His fan pages shut down, not with drama, but with indifference. Where his name once sparked controversy, now it barely sparked memory. And that was the true end, not being hated, but being forgotten. The very currency Darren once thrived on, attention, was no longer available to him, not because anyone took it from him, but because he devalued it with every thoughtless, cruel post he ever made. Clara's legacy wasn't loud, but it was permanent. It wasn't painted in viral moments. It was carved into relationships, communities, systems, and structures that had finally decided enough was enough. She didn't burn down the old world for spectacle. She quietly built a better one next door, and people moved in on their own. That's the thing about genuine leadership. You don't have to drag people toward it. You simply build a path worth walking, and others will find it in their own time. Darren never figured that out. By the time he realized no apology could rebuild the world he lost, Clara wasn't even thinking about him anymore. Her focus was forward. And the people walking with her were done apologizing for taking up space in a world that had too long demanded their disappearance. They were here to stay. And now they were leading too. The most remarkable part of Clara's journey wasn't that she overcame a single betrayal or that she dismantled Darren's carefully curated empire of mockery. It was that she proved something far more unsettling to those invested in the old systems of influence. She demonstrated that you didn't need to destroy something loudly for it to collapse. All you needed was to refuse to participate. The absence of participation was more effective than any viral outrage. It was the quiet, steady choice to say, "No, not this time," over and over, until the mechanisms built on exploitation simply fell apart under their own weight. What Clara revealed was that power isn't stolen by force, it's surrendered through neglect, and that's exactly what happened to Darren's entire brand. As the movement Clara sparked continued growing, more people began to recognize that they had never really consented to the kind of content they'd been consuming for years. They didn't truly enjoy the humiliation videos, the fat-shaming edits, the influencers disguising insecurity as edgy comedy. They had been conditioned to believe that was entertainment because algorithms rewarded provocation over compassion. But once someone showed them an alternative, it was like tasting real food after years of processed substitute. They didn't want to go back. And even those who didn't follow Clara directly began changing their habits. Unsubscribing, unfollowing, disengaging from creators who built their followings on cruelty. Clara became synonymous with that quiet refusal to conform. She wasn't demanding attention with staged tears or confessionals. She wasn't building alliances with celebrities to boost her brand. She was building communities. Real ones. Digital spaces where people didn't have to posture or filter their lives into curated perfection. Where people could show up messy, confused, imperfect, and still be seen fully. And that was far more intoxicating than any algorithm-driven dopamine hit. People didn't log in for outrage anymore. They logged in for relief. And when they logged off, they didn't feel depleted. They felt capable. That's what Clara was giving them. Not distraction, but dignity. And as this shift took hold, businesses had to scramble to keep up. Companies that once prided themselves on edgy, exclusionary advertising strategies suddenly found themselves in crisis meetings. PR firms started pitching authenticity, not as a buzzword, but as a survival strategy. Models who had once been marginalized for not fitting impossible standards now graced magazine covers, not as diversity hires, but as standard-bearers of a new cultural aesthetic rooted in reality rather than illusion. And through it all, Clara kept doing what she'd been doing from the beginning, refusing to shrink. Perhaps the greatest testament to her impact was how unnecessary she made herself over time. The true mark of leadership isn't how many followers you gather, it's how few people need you to lead once they've learned to lead themselves. Clara didn't center herself in every conversation. She kept redirecting people back to their own agency, their own power. And slowly, the landscape shifted, not because a single hero saved everyone, but because millions of ordinary people decided they were done participating in their own dehumanization. The aftermath for Darren was a slow erosion. His content didn't just lose views, it became embarrassing to associate with. Influencers who had once collaborated with him quietly deleted old videos, hoping no one would notice. Talent agencies scrubbed his name from their client list. Even reaction channels, which thrived on mocking others, didn't bother mentioning him anymore, not because of loyalty, but because mentioning Darren's name became a signal of cultural cluelessness. He didn't represent rebellion or risk-taking anymore. He represented failure, specifically the failure to adapt, to evolve, to read the room. And influencers feared irrelevance more than criticism. Meanwhile, Clara was setting entirely new terms for what success could look like online. Instead of monetizing every interaction, she helped fund community platforms where creators could own their own content, free from exploitative contracts or algorithm manipulation. These platforms didn't prioritize appearance or provocation. They prioritized substance, contribution, real connection. And while advertisers didn't immediately understand how to market in these spaces, the audiences grew regardless, choosing value over spectacle, impact over impulsivity. What Darren failed to see was that influence isn't measured by reach alone, it's measured by resonance. And Clara's work resonated in a way Darren's numbers never could. Even schools started adapting their teaching strategies. Media literacy wasn't just about spotting fake news anymore, It became about recognizing manipulation techniques in influencer culture, understanding the economics of shame, and building resilience against online humiliation tactics. And everywhere that curriculum went, Clara's story became a touchstone, not because she was exceptional, but because she was relatable. She didn't wear the scars of internet cruelty as a badge of honor. She wore them as proof that survival wasn't just possible, it was transformative. The irony of Darren's downfall was that he truly believed he was untouchable. His early success had insulated him with an echo chamber of fans who defended every misstep, who called every critic jealous or too sensitive, who weaponized humor as a shield against accountability. But what Darren never anticipated was that the same internet that gave him his rise would grow up. His followers got older. They got tired. They got wiser. And as they changed, the childishness of Darren's tactics became glaringly obvious. He wasn't a provocateur. He was just stuck. And no one wanted to stay stuck with him. And perhaps that was Clara's greatest contribution, not fighting against Darren's legacy, but leaving it behind entirely. She didn't build her platform in opposition to him. She built it in the absence of him. Where Darren used shame to generate clicks, Clara used empathy to generate community. Where Darren saw people's vulnerabilities as weaknesses to exploit, Clara saw them as strengths to be honored.